Sojola here. In this particular video, we'll be discussing one of the most famous and one of the most greatest South Africans to ever exist, right? His name is Hendrick Johannes van der Bijl, right? Now, Hendrik Johannes van der Bijl was a basically a young boy from South Africa, born into an Afrikaner family, right? His father was a merchant in South Africa and he was also a property investor. Now that put the family and especially the father close to people like Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, right? These were the former prime ministers of South Africa. So Hendrik basically had an opportunity to go to study in Germany. He went there and he studied physics and he went on to go and achieve a doctorate in physics. And he came back to South Africa in about 1920. And he was called by the then Prime Minister, I think it was Jan Smuts, to actually industrialize South Africa. Now, when this command came from the president, the first thing that Hendrik van der Bijl did was to establish Eskom, right? Was to establish electricity, right? Now, when one needs to industrialize, this is the first thing that you must do. You must create electricity. Now, you must not just create electricity, it must be an abundant, cheap, available energy. Now, when Hendrik van der Bijl created Eskom, it was one of the cheapest power stations or electricity producing entities in the world, right? It was about number 3 in the world, right? So one lesson that we should learn from particularly this young gentleman is that when you want to industrialize, particularly, you need to have electricity, a lot of it, and it must be abundant and it must be cheap, right? He used particularly coal, right? Because South Africa had a vast amount of coal resources, a very a huge amount of coal resources. So he used coal to achieve him wanting cheap electricity in South Africa, right? This happened in 1923. The commission came in 1923. The company actually started in 1924, right? Now, carrying on with the decree from Prime Minister Ian Smuts, he needed to establish steel, right? Now, he needed to establish a steel company, right? He established a company called ESCO, right? Basically meaning Iron and Steel Corporation, right? So basically he's got cheap electricity and now he produces cheap steel. Now there are two very important ingredients in industrialization: cheap electricity, right, and cheap steel, right? Now, to produce cheap steel, you need a number of things, right? You need iron ore, right? We've got a lot of that in South Africa, in the Northern Cape, right? Number 2, you need a lot of coal. Now, the type of coal that you need is not the type of coal that you need to burn in a power station. This type of coal that you need is metallurgical coal, right? Coal that you use to produce steel. So basically, you take an iron ore, you take a metallurgical coal, you add a bit of limestone there, and then you put that in something called a blast furnace, right? Blast furnace basically is something which melts all of these ingredients together to produce steel, right? Steel is basically a combination of iron and a very low percentage of carbon, right, to produce certain mechanical properties from bending elastically, shaping, forging, and things like that. Right, these are the two very important elements that we must take note of if we want to industrialize South Africa, right? Cheap electricity and cheap steel, right? Now, the third most important thing that the young man introduced, Hendrick van der Bijl, was an institution named IDC, right? Industrial Development Corporation. So basically, this was to fund every other thing which was to proceed from these two established institutions, right, in South Africa. So when the importance of steel, right, is that it is basically, you can think of steel as the flesh and bones of the economy, right? The flesh and bones. And you can think of the electricity as the consciousness of the economy. Now, if you've got cheap steel and cheap electricity, it means you can produce cheap equipment and machinery, because a lot of equipment and machinery and things that we use are basically made from steel, right? So basically, with cheap steel and cheap electricity, right, you could produce things like railways, right, agricultural equipment, mining equipment, automotive equipment. A lot of industries use steel, you know, in the form of equipment and products of that nature. So basically, these are the three most important things that you need to consider when you are industrializing: cheap electricity, cheap steel, right, which will help your manufacturing industry, which will aid your agricultural industry and produce your manufacturing industry, also your construction industry. But you must also have an institution that will make funding available for manufacturers and whoever wants to produce products from these two things which are available. Thank you very much. For more information, please watch the next video.